What is Juneteenth? Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, is an American holiday honoring African American heritage and celebrated by people of all ethnic and racial backgrounds. The 19th of June, later Juneteenth, recognizes the last Emancipation Day in America in Galveston, Texas, more than 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, when General Order Number 3 was read on June 19, 1865. Juneteenth Independence Day in America is a day to recognize and honor our ancestors who heard the news of freedom and celebrated that announcement. Juneteenth is America's second Independence Day because we were not free in 1776. Hello, I'm Dee Evans, Communications Director for National Juneteenth Observance Foundation. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Juneteenth and give you a few snapshots of United States history. The first Africans arrived on American shores in the late 1400s to early 1500s. They were navigators and crew members on ships. Records show that in 1565, Spaniards founded St. Augustine, Florida. Black crew members were preceded by Africans in the French settlement at Fort Caroline, Florida. In 1606, St. Augustine's oldest written records, the Cathedral Parish Archives, list the first birth of a black child. 1619 marked the arrival of the first indentured Africans under British colonial control at Point Comfort, Virginia. Both Point Comfort and Jamestown were English settlements. Indentured servants served up to 15 years in bondage and then they were freed. Those who were freed were then able to purchase land and obtain their own servants. They were able to marry whites and Indians, but that all changed when the institution of slavery became legal when Virginia acknowledged slavery in its laws in 1661. 1655, Anthony Johnson won a court case that let him keep another African, John Casor, as his slave, instead of ending his indentured servitude. Yes, some blacks were not only free, but sometimes they were slave owners too. The never-discussed first Underground Railroad ran from the British southern colonies farther south into Spanish Florida. In 1738, the first legally recognized community of ex-slaves was Fort Mose, the northern defense of St. Augustine. In 1770, one of the first martyrs to the cause of American patriotism was Crispus Attucks, a former slave who was killed by British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. Some 5,000 black soldiers and sailors fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War, which ran from 1775 to 1783. For 250 years, enslaved people tilled the land, built the structures, raised the children of the slave owners, losing their own children, language, names, and culture in the process. When researching family trees, our traceable history often hits a wall in 1870. Census records only listed free persons by name. Prior slave schedules only listed the owner, the sex, and the age of the enslaved. When the slave owner died, slaves were passed on with the household goods as inherited items, like dishes, farm animals, and tools, or sold to raise money. By the numbers, 75% of white families in the United States own not a single slave. 1% of families owned 40 or more. Just 0.1% of Americans owned 100 or more slaves. 0.1%. Slaves could be awarded as prizes in raffles, wagered in gambling, offered as security for loans, and transferred as gifts from one person to another. The education of slaves was prohibited, and slaves were prohibited from reading and writing. Slaves could not assemble without a white person present. Marriages between slaves were not considered legally binding. They were not allowed to leave their owners' plantations without permission. Slaveholders, whipped, shackled, hanged, beat, burned, mutilated, branded, and imprisoned slaves. The offspring of a slave woman with a man of any race was born into slavery. In 1776, approximately 8% of African Americans were free. By 1810, 4% of African Americans in the South and 75% in the North were free. But by 1860, nearly 90% of the total African American population were slaves. The nation's black population was 4.4 million, of which 3.9 million were slaves. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses during the early to mid-19th century, used by African American slaves to escape into free states and into Canada. One estimate suggests that more than 100,000 slaves escaped via the railroad. Because many freedom seekers could not read, visual and audible clues such as patterns and quilts, song lyrics, and star positions provided directional cues along the way. Conductors moved the runaways from station to station and would direct the runaways to the north. During the Civil War, Harriet Tubman worked for the Union Army as a nurse, a cook, and a spy. She returned to the South 19 times to bring more than 300 fugitives to freedom. The Civil War was fought from April 12, 1861 to May 13, 1865. Jefferson Davis served as the only president of the Confederate States. He was the 23rd U.S. Secretary of War, serving under U.S. President Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. He represented Mississippi in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives prior to becoming President of the Confederacy. Cathay Williams, also known as William Cathay, was the first known African American woman to enlist in the United States Army, and the only black woman documented to serve in the U.S. Army in the 19th century. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, but did not cover all states. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln that proclaimed the freedom of slaves in only 10 of the states then in rebellion. Not all of the slaves were free. The order applied to 3.1 million of the 4 million slaves in the Confederate States at that time. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. The proclamation did not compensate the owners outlaw slavery or grant ex-slaves called freedmen citizenship. In 1864, Nevada became the 36th state added to the Union during the Civil War. June 19, 1865, General Order No. 3, read in Galveston, Texas, told slaves there that they were free. This is the date recognized as Juneteenth. Order No. 3 reads, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that of employer and hired labor." They were also told, "The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution officially outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. On December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified by the states and slavery was abolished. In 1870, Senator Hiram Revels of Mississippi and Representative Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first African Americans to serve in Congress. In 1874, Robert Smalls was elected to Congress. 12 years earlier, Smalls had piloted the Planter, on which he worked as a slave crewman, and delivered it to the Union, which made him a national hero. More than 100 years later, in 1992, Carol Moseley Braun was elected to the U.S. Senate, becoming the first black woman to earn that distinction. In 2008, Barack Obama, the first president of African American descent, was elected and served 2 terms. Check out some books from the library or go online to learn more of our history today. Support legislation to recognize Juneteenth as a national day of observance. Visit our website. Join us and become part of the modern Juneteenth movement. African American youth must be educated on their story, from their culture and contributions to civilizations in Africa, their enslavement in the Caribbean and North America, their hidden stories in the building of America, the influences on the culture of America, and the fight for civil rights. How, in the face of harsh, cruel, and inhumane treatment as a people, those of African American descent have prevailed and emerged as the most emulated people all over the globe. Thank you for listening.
Celebrate, yeah.